You've probably heard the baby boomers. You know about Generation X. Millennials dominate the conversation today, but there's another generation nearly as large, deeply influential, and strangely overlooked. A generation that sat quietly between the loud headlines of history. If you were born between 1954 and 1965, you may have lived your entire life with a subtle but persistent feeling that something about your experience was never fully acknowledged. You were always there, participating in every major cultural shift of the late 20th century, yet your story was almost always absorbed into someone else's. Sociologists have a name for this group now: Generation Jones, a narrow cohort that grew up in the shadow of the baby boom, but came of age in a very different world. They were close enough to older boomers to be labelled the same, yet their formative years unfolded under completely different circumstances. That small shift in timing changed everything. And understanding the psychology of Generation Jones reveals something deeper than a demographic label. It explains a particular mindset, shaped by expectation, adaptation, and quiet resilience. To understand Generation Jones, you have to begin with the atmosphere they were born into. Childhood, in the late 1950s and early 1960s, was saturated with one powerful narrative: the promise of the post-war American dream. Society seemed to move in a clear direction: economic expansion, suburban growth, stable careers. Television, advertising, and school messaging repeated the same idea over and over. If you worked hard, stayed responsible, and followed the rules, a stable and prosperous adult life would naturally follow. For children growing up in that environment, the future felt structured. There was a sense that the world had already built the path you would walk. Education would lead to opportunity. Jobs would lead to stability. Stability would lead to family security and upward mobility. It was not merely hope. It felt like a social contract. Generation Jones absorbed that message during childhood just as deeply as older baby boomers did. But when their turn to enter adulthood arrived, the atmosphere had already begun to change. By the mid-1970s and early 1980s, the confidence of the post-war era had started to fracture. Economic stagnation appeared where expansion once seemed guaranteed. Housing costs rose faster than wages. Corporate structures began shifting. Job security weakened. Political trust eroded. The path that had once appeared predictable became increasingly uncertain. This timing matters more than it may seem. Psychologists often talk about expectation violation. That moment when the future you were taught to believe in no longer aligns with the world you actually enter. For Generation Jones, that violation happened at the exact moment when adult identity normally solidifies. They didn't grow up expecting struggle. They grew up expecting stability. And then they encountered volatility just as adulthood began. This subtle rupture shaped a distinct psychological pattern. On one level, many in this generation still carried the values they were raised with: responsibility, discipline, long-term commitment, the belief that effort should lead to reward. But on another level, their lived experience quietly contradicted that belief. What developed was a mindset that could be described as practical realism. Not the broad optimism of older boomers who entered adulthood during economic expansion, and not the deep institutional skepticism often associated with Generation X. Generation Jones sits somewhere between those two orientations. They still believed in stability. They simply learned that stability could not be taken for granted. This dual awareness created a subtle but powerful internal tension. The desire to trust the system remained, but it was accompanied by a growing instinct to protect oneself from its unpredictability. Plans became more cautious. Careers became more strategic. Security became something to build deliberately rather than something assumed. Over time, this mindset shaped how Generation Jones approached work. For many, professional success was not just about ambition or personal fulfillment. It became a way to secure footing in a world that had already shown itself to be less stable than promised. Titles mattered, competence mattered, being seen as reliable and indispensable mattered. These were not merely career goals, they were psychological anchors. If the future could not be guaranteed, then measurable achievement became one of the few things that could still provide certainty. Many in Generation Jones became known for steady diligence, not flashy ambition, but persistent effort, loyalty to organisations, willingness to endure restructuring and change, a quiet determination to remain valuable even as industries shifted around them. There was also another pressure unique to their generational position. They often found themselves competing in two directions at once. Older boomers had entered the workforce earlier and occupied many established positions of authority. Meanwhile, younger colleagues adapted quickly to emerging technologies and cultural changes. Generation Jones frequently navigated the space between these two groups, striving for parity with those above while maintaining relevance among those below. This in-between position appeared again during one of the largest transitions of modern history, the shift from an analog world to a digital one. Generation Jones is often the last group to fully remember life before computers dominated everyday work. They learned on typewriters, used rotary phones, filed paper documents, and worked inside hierarchical office systems. Yet, unlike many older boomers, they were still young enough during their careers to be directly reshaped by the rise of personal computers, the internet, and digital communication. They became translators between two eras, explaining legacy systems to younger workers while learning new technological tools alongside them, bridging the procedural discipline of the analog age with the speed and flexibility of the digital world. Being a bridge between eras can create a certain kind of fatigue. You move fluently across contexts, but rarely feel fully defined by either. To older colleagues, you may seem too adaptable. To younger ones, you may appear tied to older structures. Recognition becomes situational rather than stable. This experience reinforced a familiar theme in the psychology of Generation Jones: being present at pivotal moments without always being clearly recognized for them. That same pattern often appeared in personal relationships as well. Many in this generation grew up with relational models shaped by mid-century values. Commitment, responsibility, and endurance were central to the idea of partnership. Yet their adult relationships unfolded during decades of rapid social and economic change. Love was expected to last, but life had already shown that stability could not be assumed. As a result, emotional expression within this generation often took a particular form. Care was frequently communicated through reliability rather than words, providing, supporting, remaining present through strain. These actions became the language of love. This emotional style was not coldness, it was containment. When careers, finances, and family obligations were under pressure, feelings were often carried privately so as not to add further weight to already demanding systems. When Generation Jones became parents, this dual awareness of promise and uncertainty shaped how they raised their children. Many encouraged ambition, creativity, and self-expression more openly than previous generations had. They wanted their children to feel that the possibilities of the future were wide open. But beneath that encouragement was also vigilance. Having experienced firsthand how quickly opportunity could narrow, many parents in this cohort moved to actively secure pathways for their children. Education planning began early. Extracurricular activities accumulated. Performance signals were closely monitored. The message was both inspiring and protective. You can become anything, but you must also remain competitive, prepared, and safe. For many millennials raised by Generation Jones parents, this created a childhood environment where belief and pressure existed side by side. Aspiration was encouraged, but achievement was also framed as protection against an uncertain world. By midlife, many in Generation Jones had reached positions of significant influence. They became executives, senior professionals, policymakers, and institutional leaders. Outwardly, this appeared to fulfill the promise of stable adulthood that had once seemed uncertain. Yet the earlier imprint of volatility rarely disappeared completely. Even after achieving success, many remained vigilant. Industries could shift, markets could collapse, careers could stall. The possibility of downward mobility remained cognitively present. As a result, leadership within this generation often carries a pragmatic tone. Authority is exercised carefully. Reputation is guarded. Professional identity remains closely tied to continued performance. Achievement is not simply enjoyed, it is maintained. Now, as Generation Jones moves deeper into later life, a quiet reflection sometimes emerges. A question that surfaces during retirement planning, career transitions, or moments of pause. Was it enough? Not only financially or professionally, but existentially. Did the decades of effort, adaptation, and responsibility finally deliver the stability that childhood once promised? Or did life become a continuous process of stabilizing what never fully settled? Yet there is another way to understand this generational journey. Generation Jones did not merely inherit a changing world. They helped carry society through one of its largest transitions. They bridged eras, absorbed economic shocks, adapted to technological revolutions, and still built careers, families, and institutions that later generations now rely upon. Their story is not defined by invisibility, even if it was often described that way. It is defined by continuity under pressure, by the quiet work of holding systems together while the ground beneath them shifted, and perhaps that is why their psychology is so distinctive. A mixture of hope and caution, ambition and realism, loyalty and adaptability. They were raised to expect stability, learned to navigate instability, and spent much of their lives building stability for others. If you were born somewhere between 1954 and 1965, this in-between generation may have shaped your mindset more than you realized. And if you recognize yourself in this story, you're not alone. Millions of people share this same quiet generational imprint. I'd be genuinely curious to hear from you. What year were you born, and how do you think this overlooked generation shaped your life path? Share your experience in the comments. And if this perspective resonated with you, consider subscribing for more explorations into the psychology of generations and the hidden forces that shape our lives.